African women generally had more freedom than women in other places, so much so that your countries sometimes call it matrilineal. In other words, they would trace their lineage through a woman rather than through a man. So a person would consider, and part of this was, and both the Jews today do the same thing. You become a Jew if your mother was a Jew. If your father is a Jew and your mother is not, they don't consider you a Jew because your mother was not a Jew. So again, patriarchal, and part of this was because they felt like, well, we always know who the mother was of the child, but sometimes we don't know who the father was. So they would trace the lineage through a woman. This gave the woman in Africa a lot more authority than they would have in other places. A man would not pass his inheritance on to his own sons, but rather to his sister's sons. So if a man built up, an African man built up wealth, when he died, his goods would go to his sister's sons, not to his own.
Why was that?
Again, because they felt like a man would feel like, I can't be certain sure that these sons I call my sons are really mine. But my sister, I mean, I know that this woman is my sister, and I know her sons because she, after all, bore the sons, so I know that they're hers. So he was more sure that her sons were related to him than he were his own sons. If you follow the logic. And believe me, even in the modern world, Jewish people do the same thing. You can be more sure of a person's mother. Now today we have DNA tests that can do a lot to determine patrimony. In those days, they didn't. Which brings me to my next point. I don't want to elaborate on this, but I'm looking at the bottom page 231. African people had fewer taboos between the sexes than just about any other society. In other words, the women were not necessarily expected to be faithful to their husbands, even though they had a husband, which was one reason the man could not be sure that he was the father of his wife's child. Again, they had fewer taboos between the sexes than most other people had. The book goes on to devote about a half a page to the subject of slavery. Oh yes, something else. So to talk about women, I must mention the liberty that women had made it difficult for Islam. You know, there was one reason that Islam did not take over sub-Saharan Africa like they did this part of Africa, is sub-Saharan Africa had some cultural traits that just made it difficult for Islam. One of them was the freedom the Africans gave to women. And under Islam, women are property, women are owned. In African society, women were free, and African people were just slow to accept that what Islam taught, that women were property. So Islam had a difficult time making, actually Islam never really took over and ruled over this part of Africa. They made inroads there, they were there, but they never ruled, and part of it was some of the cultural things that Africa had. And when we come to India, we're going to talk the same thing. Islam ran counter to some Indian traditions also. And they certainly ran counter to some sub-Saharan African traditions. The book goes on to talk about painting and sculpture and shows an example of African metalwork, some really high quality artwork they achieved there. Music. Now, I've had students miss this question on a test, and again, I'm not sure you'll see it on a test or not. They didn't believe the Africans had the xylophone. Yes, African music features a heavy beat, heavy metal beat, what we call heavy metal, with, among other instruments, the xylophone, which they had in abundance. They had pipe instruments, they had stringed instruments. And if you're driving along in a car on a summer day, pull up to a stop sign and hear some really, really heavy metal music coming out of a nearby car. If you look over, the person inside the car might probably be African. Not knocking at folk, just simply stating fact. A lot of times they like to beat. They're very, very heavy beat. They have like this all down through the ages, all down through time as far as we know. what we call heavy music, heavy metal, call it heavy rock or whatever. That featured the xylophone. All right. Now, with that being said, oh yes, a lot of Africans constructed their civilized structures out of stone, or in some cases out of mud. Which your book shows a picture of on page 235. All right, leave it.